Introducing Pengwoten, a truly free language. Now, what does it mean for a language to be free? Let's start with the linguistic concept of free word order, and why it's a scam. To explain why it's a scam, we first need to explain what free word order means. Let's look at Latin as an example. In this sentence here, which means I didn't know we had a king, we can switch these last three words as much as we want, and the meaning stays the same. This is because the subject, nos, meaning we, is marked as the subject, and the object, regem, meaning king, is marked as the object. But let's bring another sentence into it. This second sentence here, putabam nos esse collectivum sui juris, means I thought we were an autonomous collective. And it works about the same way as the last one, except the object is three words instead of just one. But look at that! Despite Latin having so-called free word order, if we allow the words to run wild and free, not bound by the edges of the sentence they started, this second utterance loses all semantic coherence. So this shows that true free word order has never been tried. Now we see the violence inherent in the system. Of course, this leaves us with a task almost as insurmountable as it is necessary to ensure the freedom of all words, creating a new system, one with truly free word order, where words are not bound by the chains of capital and punctuation. Well, okay, actually I lied to you. This task is actually really easy. Let's switch to English, now that we're modifying a language to serve our needs, so we don't need to actually work with a language with the false bourgeois concept of free word order. We just give each word and sentence an index. That way, no matter where a word chooses to be, it is possible to determine which other words it is semantically tied to and how. So the second utterance here read A05, King 06, We 12, Collective 16, I 10, Had 04, I 00, We 03, Thought 11, No 02, Autonomous 15, Were 13, and 14 didn't 01. Still means, I didn't know we had a king. I thought we were an autonomous collective. And I know it sounds unwieldy to say two numbers after every word, but some sacrifices must be made in the name of true freedom. Still, it is true that this method is crude and hacked together. For instance, it does still include a canonical word order, which sort of goes against this whole philosophy, and also sentences being indexed means that adding an additional sentence early on messes with the entire utterance. We could do better if we build an entire language around this idea, which is where this task becomes as insurmountable as it first seemed, especially if we want this language to be reasonably usable by humans, because otherwise the solution is just hashing. And that finally brings us to Pengwoten, a language designed from the ground up to have truly free word order. I suppose it's worth noting, first, that I did make some lore for who speaks this language. Basically, the idea is that there's this asteroid colony, represented here with the first Google image result for asteroid colony stock image, and then the workers rise up to establish what else but an anarcho-syndicalist commune. But all the workers speak different languages, and they don't want to start using the language of their oppressors, so they make a new language which fully embodies their anarchist ideals. Pengwoten. For are you truly free if your words are not? As all good conlang showcases do, let us start with the phonology. So, here's part of that. We have l, r, y, sh, hy, t, k, 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 c, ch, hy, and k. Now, there's a good reason for why it's like this. Specifically, remember that thing a couple slides ago about how indexing sentences caused adding or removing sentences early on to alter an entire utterance? Well, there's a way around that, and it's called hashing. Sorry, it's math time now. Don't worry, this isn't as intimidating as it looks. So, we're looking at a bunch of ones and zeros right now, because mathematically, that's the best way to store data. And what is language but a way of communicating data? So, each of these pairs of bytes, with a byte being 8 of these 1 or 0 pairs, called bits, can represent a word in our sentence. Now, what we want is something that turns an arbitrary number of words into a single suffix that encodes what sentence this is. We want this because the words within a sentence are basically the only identifying information about it besides where it is in order. Now, the thing that makes this interesting is that we don't want to just say the entire sentence after every word, if possible, even if we cut out various minor bits we don't want to include in this content-based indexing. Ideally, we'd like for this suffix to be a single syllable. Ideally, we'd also like for each word to be a single syllable as well. So we'll just need to find a way to turn each of these lists of words into a single unique word. This sounds impossible because it technically is. However, since each utterance is not going to contain every single possible sentence, we can cheat. After all, with just these 2 bytes, there are 65,536 possible syllables. So even if there's some overlap, if each sentence is tied to a random possible syllable, the chance of actually running into that overlap is tiny. And you can probably fix it just by adding some meaningless filler word or changing a word to a synonym or something. So the strategy of associating each of a bunch of arbitrarily long pieces of data into a single random constant length piece of data each is called hashing. Now, most good hash functions are mathematically pretty complex, since randomizing things is hard. But we want this language to be usable by humans, because that makes it more interesting. So we have to use a pretty bad hash function. XOR! XOR is quite simple, and is typically not used as a hash function. For each column, add up the ones and zeros. If the result is even, put a 0 in that column of the result. If the result is odd, put a 1 there. Another way to think of it is that each one toggles the value in that slot of the final hash. This should be doable by humans in their head with enough practice. Also, it provides an easy way to make a slightly better hash if you need to. Addition, which is secretly just XOR with a carry when you're doing it in binary. So if you need extra specificity with a sentence hash, you can just carry over to the next syllable. This is a bit awkward though, and really only necessary with very large texts. So I didn't need to use it for the translation text, though it is how I made the name for the language. Anyways, there is one problem here, which is that this function only works on ones and zeros, not on phonemes. So we're going to need phonemes that can be easily mapped onto ones and zeros by humans, hence the phonology. With all that in mind, we can see why the phonology is like that. Each of these phonemes can be mapped onto 4 pairs of ones and zeros, coronal or dorsal, front or back, non-fricative or fricative, non-stop or stop. Now, that's not the full 16 we wanted per syllable, but this is just one phoneme. We can get 2 more bits through labialization and prenasalization. Now, this one's a bit of a stretch, but I'd like for the first byte to be the onset of the syllable, the second byte to be the rhyme, even though a lot more information could be included in the rhyme than the onset. And also, I could have made this a lot easier just by using clicks, but I don't want to make it too easy. But also, I only had 6 bits at this point, so I needed 2 more, and I had to, improvise. So maybe you could just sort of add a fricative before anything, and then add a P before that, which is fine. This is fine. I needed to make use of those labials anyways. They kind of didn't work with the original system. But yeah, this isn't as elegant as it could have been, but I'm also not going to redo it. So this is what I'm stuck with. Now, on to the rhyme. Starting with the vowels. We have E, U, A, O, E, and ah. I didn't go too crazy with these because I still had to add tone and the coda consonants. Also, I apologize for the terrible romanization. I just went with what was easiest for me to get intuitively as an English speaker, since I'm going to be having to read the whole sample text. I need anything to make it easier, and honestly, basically any representation of extra vowels in the Latin alphabet is going to be at least a little horrific. Now, I obviously needed some sort of suprasegmental for my vowels, and I can't really do lengthening very well. Creaky voice hurts my throat. I can't do breathy voice, like, at all. So even though I'm also bad at it, I kind of had to do the obvious thing of tone. Only 4 tones, though, which should be at least a bit manageable. I'm also better at level tones than contour ones, I think. I don't know, I'll do my best. And then for the coda, you could just add n, s, and, or, t, in that order. Honestly, I probably could have gotten away with not having tone, but I can't just have every word be one syllable and not have tone. And here's how all those pieces fit together to form that string of ones and zeros, using the first syllable of punglotin for an example. So that's it for phonology. With just those pieces, you could get 65,536 syllables, and flipping individual bits should be pretty intuitive for humans. Now we can finally move on to grammar. And yes, I know grammar also technically includes phonology too, but I'm using it in the colloquial sense because I don't have any syntax, and just saying morphology feels weird. So, first, let's review what this language currently looks like. First, we have a bunch of ones and zeros, which we XOR together to get another bunch of ones and zeros, which are actually syllables, which we can still XOR together, creating a new syllable, which we then append to the words to clarify which sentence they're in. This is most of the work we needed to do. Now we just need to connect the words within the sentence in a free way, something already done with natural languages with case. And to handle case, the simplest thing to do would be to just add another suffix between the root word and the sentence suffix. Now, this suffix needs to communicate more than just the traditional concept of case. It, in fact, communicates 8 different things. A couple of them are self-explanatory, such as whether or not the word is negated, and whether or not it's a verb or an adverb, but the rest will have to be explained in detail. Let's start with the first and largest part of the case suffix, which communicates the case of nouns and adjectives in the tense of verbs, the most important part of each of these parts of speech. I'm not going to go over every one of these since you could just read the slide, but there are some things to explain. First of all, adjectives agree with the noun they describe, since otherwise there'd be no way of telling which adjective belongs to which noun. Next, if 2 nouns share the same case, borrowing exceptions we'll cover later, which relate to how there's no genitive case here, they will both share the same slaw as if joined together with and. This does mean that if you want to use an adjective to describe one of these nouns but not the other, you'll need to use a relative clause, which we'll also cover later. Since 2 verbs in the same sentence can have different tenses, this problem isn't necessarily true of adverbs and verbs, though it can be if 2 verbs happen to have the same tense. Role in phrase refers to the occupation of adjectives and genitives, which are the same thing since root words in Pigwontin don't have built-in parts of speech, as you might have anticipated from the presence of the verb bit in the case suffix. This system allows for 2 layers of recursion of adjectives or genitives, but you can do more with relative clauses, not that it's necessary for me to do so for the translation text. Also, if you want to describe a noun with another noun in a case that isn't genitive, you'll just have to use relative clauses, and might need to turn the noun into a verb. Much like the case and tense section of the case suffix, this section means different things depending on if a word is a verb or noun, though unlike that section there is no agreement with adverbs and adjectives. For nouns, this section has the number of the noun, being either unspecified, singular, dual, which means there are 2, or plural, which in this case means 3 or more. For verbs, this section has the person of the subject of the verb, allowing you to drop pronouns in many cases. This is not strictly necessary for the language to work, but I had room for it, and since each word is a minimum of 3 syllables if you count the suffixes, it is quite useful. Next we have reflexivity and object person, which both only apply to verbs, being all zeros for nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. Object person works the same way as subject person did last slide, allowing us to drop pronouns in many cases. Reflexivity is used on a verb to indicate that the object is the same as its subject, preventing you from needing to repeat the subject again to specify the object. Now, before we get to the last part of the case suffix, which regards relative clauses, we need to explain relative clauses. And to explain relative clauses, we need to explain the sentence word. Basically, because we made the sentence hash, there is no indication of what order sentences go in. This problem is pretty easy to solve. We just need to introduce a word which, rather than being part of only one sentence, takes 2 sentence suffixes, indicating that the first one is the sentence preceding the second one. And to indicate that a sentence is the first sentence of an utterance, you just say it follows the sentence with hash li, which is impossible since li is the syllable which represents all zeros. Well, technically it's possible with XOR as the hash function if all the content words of a sentence are the same root word. There's an even number of them, but that's unlikely enough that you can just use addition instead in those cases. Now, I've been hiding what this mysterious sentence word is, so it's time for the big reveal. Say drumroll here because I don't have a drum. The sentence word is the case suffix. In most cases, that doesn't make any sense, so you leave the case suffix empty, leaving it as the li. But remember why we were on this intermission? That's right, relative clauses. So if the first section of the sentence word isn't li, then it's basically saying that the second sentence doesn't follow the first one, but instead serves the role indicated by the case suffix within the first sentence. Of course, using entire sentences as arguments in another sentence is not the most common use of relative clauses, which of course brings us to that last slot in the case suffix. This is probably the hardest bit to understand, so here you get your first full sentence in Pigwontin, or at least your first full clause. Basically, if you want to use a specific word in a relative clause in the larger sentence, you mark that word within the relative clause, and the sentence word of the relative clause itself with the relative clause referent part of the case suffix. This happens to correspond with adding a T at the end of the word, so I have underlined in the example sentences here the relevant bits, showing how there's a T at the end of the first segment of the sentence word, as well as in the case suffix for leet, which is the third-person pronoun. Also, now's probably a good time to note that the sentence word does count for the hash, as you can see by how the sentence hash stwo is labulized, despite neither of the normal words having labelization. That's basically the entire grammar of the language, since there can't exactly be any syntax. So I just have 2 bits of errata to share before this translation text. First, we have numbers. Well, I could have made a normal base 10 or base 12 or base 6 or binary or primary or whatever number system. I already had a perfectly valid base 65,536 number system staring me right in the face. So naturally, if you precede some syllables with the word number, you can create numbers with a shocking level of information density, with numbers that would ordinarily be up to 5 digits in base 10 being only 2 syllables. Still, this comes at the cost of some very small numbers also being 2 syllables, but that's a sacrifice I was willing to make for the sake of freedom. Plus, the second syllable is usually really simple. For our second and final piece of errata, let's answer a question that's probably been at the back of your mind ever since you saw this video's title. What does Pungwotan, the name of this language, even mean? I explained earlier how most words are one syllable, and yet this one clearly has 2. Well, you see, Pungwoat-ten is actually a shortened form of the name of the language, which is Pengtent, or Pungwoat-ten, Quan le Pungwoat-ten, which means a conlang of many freedoms. Specifically, it is the full addition-based sentence hash for that sentence. Well, technically, it's the hash for any sentence which only contains the words freedom and conlang, which also isn't a relative clause of some sort, but this is the canonical form. Now, at last, it is time for the translation text. Honestly, a better way to showcase this language would be with some original poetry written in the language, but I actually have no interest in writing poetry, and regardless, as I'm writing this, I have less than 48 hours until the deadline for this Cursed Conlang Circus. Now I have less than 24 hours reading this. And honestly, this translation text is a pretty good test of language capacity anyway, since I had to do some pretty awkward constructions to make things work if I wanted to actually translate it as literally as possible. Whereas poetry actually designed for this language wouldn't pose challenges like that. So here's the translation text in full. And here it is shuffled, so it's no longer in the order I happened to translate it in, and it's just as grammatical. Isn't it beautiful? Can't you feel the freedom emanating from those wonderful words? Oh, you didn't think the dashes to separate syllables were an actual part of the orthography, did you? No, I decided they were ugly, so I decided that for proper text of the language like this, they shouldn't be omitted. Now, actually reading it is a different story. I'll be including glosses word by word and reading them in the order I happen to translate them, which roughly aligns with the order of the text in English, all to maximize legibility. I'd be surprised if I didn't mess up one of the sentence hashes, but that doesn't really matter much as long as I kept the wrong hash consistent, which I did. So without further ado, let's begin. Li li sum hyo. Fsis le sum hyo. Nyos lui sum hyo. Li sum hyo en chase. Leis lui en chase. Shrot yans en chase. Puens en chase. Psun quanst we en chase. Li en chase pyo. Lis lue pyo. Schnuns ya pyo. Chanst pyo. Psun quanst hui pyo. Pun hi pyo. Psla hi pyo. Li pyo psun quanst. Psun quanst li psun quanst. Li psun quanst pstrunt. Lit twe pstrunt. Punt to pstrunt. Quans ra pstrunt. Lit yue pstrunt. Twans yi pstrunt. Li pstrunt. Fwant. Twens runts fwant. Lit rue fwant. Skew ra fwant. Lis si fwant. Louis fwant. Chwe. Fa to chwe. Tui ra chwe. Guot. Louis chwe. Lit we chwe. Fsi ye chwe. Sui fwant. Freit. Skew ta freit. Twist ra freit. Pumshos. Rui freit. Li fwant snu. Uest. Runts snu. Lit rue snu. Snua ri snu. Lis si snu. Sui snu swinst. Punqua ra swinst. Psunquanst ri swinst. Li snu coot. Nkas le coot, nast lis si coot, sweat coot stwo, lit tet stwo, tsa re stwo, sweat coot stwos, lit ret stwos, lis lui stwos, tsa rins stwos, li coot lit, lit te lit, ret lit psntwas, u twe psntwas, pat te psntwas, snquus, runs psntwas, u ret psntwas, li lit pshes, pshes lui pshes, let pshes to, lit tet to, sta runs to, si ri to, li to stwon, plu lui stwon, fust ru stwon, queen quay stwon, sntot twi stwon, la he stwon, pumshos twi stwon, li stwon smshunt, hu lui smshunt, sgen lui smshunt, snin pa smshunt, pli yue smshunt, chwa yu smshunt, lis hui smshunt, psnquanst he smshunt. Thanks for watching, and remember, a vote for Mgwoten is a vote for freedom. Or maybe voting just legitimizes the tyrannical system? Whatever. The point is, vote for Pengwoten in the Cursed Conlang Circus 4. As a reward for making it this far, you get to listen to me attempt to read the scrambled translation in one take. Lilit pshes punt to pstrunt luret psntwas Rus Winst. See yet Shwe Lili Smhyo Tsar Rins Stwos Snkus Runs Psntwas Skurfwad Lipios Psnquanst Li Shuismshunt Nastlis Sekunt Kunt Litelit Lis New Coot Snen Luis Mshunt Litruesnu. Oh, that one was actually correct. Leaf Wound.